As the Mayan Empire faded into the ages, terse, rugged Norwegian explorers sailed westward along northern Europe, seizing territory in Great Britain, Ireland, Greenland, and Iceland. They were masters of navigation as they fearlessly and courageously sailed headlong into the open seas, which is something no one else would dare try. One Norwegian in particular made a living traversing along the newly formed Viking settlements. After spending the early summer of 986 AD trading commodities in Scandinavia, Bjarni Herjolfsson navigated his way back to Iceland, only to discover that his father had migrated farther west to establish residence in Greenland. Bjarni set sail immediately to pursue his father, but having never been to Greenland, he didn't know the exact route. In the midst of his brief journey, a vicious storm steered Bjarni in the wrong direction, causing his ship to skid off course in a southwest tangent. In the eerie still and in the tranquil quiet, a dense fog lifted and his eyes spotted land, but the land he saw surprised him as it was far from how Greenland's landscape had been described to him. Mountains, trees, low hills, and beaches all stunned Bjarni. He had no idea what exactly it was he had stumbled upon. But instead of landing his boat and exploring the unknown, the first white man to ever gaze upon the Americas, bravely and boldly scurried in the opposite direction. He eventually found his way back to Greenland, whereupon he reunited with his father. Bjarni never sailed back, and he would spend the rest of his life being chastised by his fellow Vikings for not exploring the mysterious land. He spent the following years regaling tales of his journey to anyone who would listen, and eventually, someone did. Eager to sail since he was a boy, the indefatigable Leif Erikson loved the stories of Bjarni, who was his father's closest friend. In 1000 AD, Erik assembled a crew of 35 men and women and he set sail from Iceland, determined to locate the new world for himself. After the passing of only a few days, he climbed ashore what is considered to be the modern-day Baffin Island. Leif evidently disliked it as he dubbed it Helluland because of its coarse and rocky terrain. Leif abandoned Helluland rather quickly and voyaged farther south to modern-day Labrador. Because of the densely wooded milieu that comprised this piece of country, Leif gave it the name Markland. His visit here was also rather expedient, and he went on to proceed to his final destination, the northern tip of Newfoundland. The agreeable climate and abundance of salmon, wheat, and grapes encouraged the Vikings to camp there over the winter. Following a string of clever names, Leif named his temporary settlement Wineland due to the strong presence of grapes. Before long, spring arrived and the Vikings left for Greenland. Leif returned the following year for the last time. During his stay, there was no evidence of encounters with the native tribes who may have dwelled there. According to legend, Leif's brother Thorvald returned to Leif's abandoned settlement in modern-day Landsal Meadow in 1001 AD. Thorvald's expedition eventually brought him farther inland where he supposedly approached a group of natives canoeing along the same stream. A vicious brawl ensued between the Vikings and the natives, and Thorvald was struck by an arrow between his left shoulder and upper chest. His wound was fatal and he eventually passed away. This meant that he was potentially the first European to die in the Americas. The Norsemen would leave this strange and hostile land for good. They would never share their discoveries with the European world, and probably never imagined that they had established brief residency on anything other than a large island. It is overreaching to accredit the Vikings as the first discoverers of America. Their findings amounted to nothing, and no map displayed the secret world by the time Columbus left Spain. The two continents would live on, completely hidden from the rest of the world for the next 500 years. Medieval history is both fascinating and multifaceted. By about 1000 AD, Europe found itself entrenched in a form of stasis. Countries constantly warred with each other, country borders changed by the year, and dynasties came and went, bringing untold death and suffering with them. France and England, who would one day wield the most powerful land army and navy respectively, were enshrined in military engagements that went nowhere. It had left them on a verge of bankruptcy for which the commoners had to pay a hefty price. Rates of illiteracy were significant, and the average life expectancy was only 31 years. The infant mortality rate ranged from 30 to 50%. Ships were poorly designed and could barely stray more than 2 miles from any coast or port. The most significant advancement in shipbuilding in Europe was the invention of the rudder in the 1200s. Under the feudal system, life comprised of unbearable tribulation where the presumed purpose for existence was to spend each day of one's life toiling until death, where one was hopefully awarded a glorious afterlife. Peasants never experienced the world beyond their lord's backyard and knew nothing of the world beyond them. But this did not last. As the 12th century emerged, it brought with it the call to arms to drive the infidels out of the Holy Land. This was known as the Crusades. It was a series of wars fought between the Christians and the Caliphate over Jerusalem, and they would last for 350 years, not ending until 1453. These wars were also fought over control of the Eastern Mediterranean as well. Little was gained from these wars except that it granted many Europeans the opportunity to sojourn to foreign lands and potentially make a fortune for themselves. The Crusades were eventually interrupted by the Mongolian conquests of the mid to late 13th century. The Mongols were a Central Asian steppe peoples who crafted the largest geographical empire in human history. In only a few decades, they occupied territory from the eastern Pacific Chinese coast to a large portion of Poland. The Mongol military ravaged any and all peoples who stood in their way, and were at one point dead set on seizing the entire Eurasian continent. However, the Mongolian campaign came to a halt because several Mongolian officials drank themselves into an early grave. Soon the empire fell into the hands of Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan. Kublai led sweeping reform within the Mongol territory and opened easily accessible and interconnected trade routes from the west to the far east. Hoping that the Mongols might favor Christianity against the Caliphate, Pope Innocent IV sent missionaries across the Middle East in an attempt to convert the Mongols to Christianity. This particular mission ended in failure, but it paved the way for European explorers to freely traverse what was known as the Silk Road. The most iconic of these missionaries were Niccolo and Maffeo Polo. They were brothers who had ascended through the European ranks as extraordinarily successful merchants. By 1260, they had established trading posts all along the Silk Road from Constantinople to western China. They even formed an amicable relationship with Kublai Khan. During their second eastward voyage in 1271, Niccolo brought along his enthusiastic 17-year-old son, Marco Polo. The adventurous youth cemented his name in the history books for mapping much of the Eastern world that was then completely unknown to Europe, such as Japan, Java, and Sumatra. By 1300 AD, Europe's trade with the East introduced them to goods and commodities that they had never seen before. For the first time, Europeans enjoyed the luxury of rice, sugar, and lemons, and exotic medicines, spices, and materials such as muslin, damask, and silk. The lowly serfs in turn sold oil, wine, furs, wool, and sulfur in droves, giving their lives a sense of purpose, which was something they had never really experienced. Along with trading goods came better improved maps, which featured more of the mysterious Pacific East and the surrounding coastal islands. Yet progress was slow and often marred by continued crusades, interfighting between France and England, and the deadliest plague to ever hit Europe. These setbacks unfortunately defined much of the 14th century, yet the strengthening conglomeration between the East and West gradually allowed for a new era of thought, scientific advancement, technological breakthroughs, and philosophical enlightenment. The 15th century is one of the most pivotal centuries in all of history, mostly because of a collage of monumental events that monopolized the latter half of the 1400s. By the year 1450, the once impervious Mongolian Empire began fragmenting into a state of degradation from which it would never recover. It would eventually lose its grasp of Asia Minor to a newly formed empire comprised of a wave of Islamic forces called the Ottomans. The Ottoman Turks decisively kicked the European forces out of the eastern Mediterranean and captured the city of Constantinople after a brutal and lengthy siege in 1453. This effectively ended the Crusades, and the Byzantine Empire dissolved, the last remnant of the ancient Roman Empire. The Ottomans now had leverage over the various trading routes marking the Middle East where much of the Silk Road ran, which meant that Europe was suddenly forced to consider contacting Asia through other means. But while shipping technology made navigation on rougher seas more plausible in Europe, the first nation to ascertain the capacity to circumnavigate the globe was not in fact any European nation, it was China. Under the Ming Dynasty, the Chinese Navy amassed an enormous armada comprising of some 3,500 ships. To put this in perspective, the US Navy today consists of just under 500 ships. The Treasure Fleet, as it was called, possessed ships that stretched up to 120 meters, making them 4 to 5 times larger than the largest European vessels, including the Santa Maria. They were equipped with numerous decks, as many as 12 sails, magnetic compasses, and a crew of 1,000 to 2,000 men per ship. By the mid-1400s, the Chinese fleet was making routine expeditions to Africa from the east, and could very well have encircled the globe, but this was not to be. The Ming Dynasty put an end to trade in favor of isolationism, and the treasure fleet was subsequently abandoned. Most of the ships were burned or destroyed, and by 1525, there was hardly anything left of the treasure fleet. China would not build up its navy in any significant way until the late 20th century. The European nations were under mounting pressure to discover alternate trade routes to the Orient, but the notion of navigating uncharted territory terrified many. That is, except for the eager young Prince of Portugal, Dom Henrique, also known as Henry the Navigator. He believed the best path to the Orient via sea was to head south and to route the African continent in order to strike India. He embarked on his campaign in the early 1400s, and in 1434 he reached the coast of Mauritania. The Portuguese soon discovered that the African continent was much larger than they could have imagined, and even though Henry died in 1460, the expedition south continued, and the Gulf of New Guinea was discovered in 1471, and the southern tip of South Africa in 1487. The Portuguese had mapped 2,000 miles of uncharted land by 1488, and had accrued immeasurable wealth from their endeavors as a result. Western Europe was spurned by envy over the Portuguese gains, but no country was more jealous than Spain. Spain underwent a tumultuous 15th century. Ferdinand of Aragon unified the Spanish kingdoms when he married Queen Isabella of Castile. Their joint union consolidated the Spanish dominions under one banner, which unleashed a lurid wave of nationalistic pride and the rapid spread of Catholicism. But before the monarchy could approach the subject of trade, they first had to rid the Iberian Peninsula of Moorish occupation. The Moors were a branch of Islam that resided in North Africa and had contended with Western Europe over territory in Spain and France for centuries. However, they had been severely weakened over time, and the Spanish, under its novice rulers, crushed the last Moorish stronghold at Granada in 1491. Now that the Moors were out, Spain was starving to pursue alternative trade routes to the Orient, but they couldn't travel south since Portugal had already claimed the African coast for itself, and the passage east was blockaded by the Ottomans. So how could they possibly reach the Orient? Ferdinand and Isabella were forced to reconsider an absurd proposal that had been brought before them only a few years earlier. A Genoese man in his late 30s once suggested that the quickest way to the Orient was neither east nor south, but west, and that he could prove it. After discarding this man's outlandish proposition, the Spanish court decided to hear him out once again. Christopher Columbus was born on October 31, 1451, to a wool merchant. For as long as he could remember, Columbus was drawn to the sea. Historians believed he sailed for the first time at the age of 10. As a teenager, he became an apprentice for a merchant crew. In 1471, his company's ship was attacked and decimated off the coast of Portugal by French privateers. Columbus abandoned ship and swam to the shores of Lisbon on a piece of drifting wood. Undeterred by the harrowing experience, he continued sailing. Several years later, he served as a member of a convoy mission sent to deliver goods to England and Ireland. During this voyage, Columbus may have traveled to Iceland, where he heard ancient tales of Leif Erikson and strange lands out west. Now in the late 1470s, an astronomer by the name of Paolo Toscanelli drew popular attention with his ardent claim that the fastest avenue to the Orient was to travel west, and amongst his many supporters was none other than Columbus himself. The idea that one could travel west and reach the Orient was predicated on the conviction that the Earth was spherical. Contrary to popular belief, the Earth was commonly accepted as spherical, even amongst the devoutly religious. The shape of the Earth was in fact correctly guessed by Aristotle, and in a strange yet timely coincidence, the first documented globe was introduced in 1491. It famously doesn't feature the American continents. While the Earth's circumference was accurately calculated in the 3rd century BC, many scholars in Columbus's time miscalculated the distance from Europe to Japan for many reasons. But to put it simply, the measurements of longitudinal and latitudinal points had always been expressed in Arabic miles instead of Roman miles. This is significant because Roman miles are much shorter. Spanish scholars using the Roman mile calculated the Earth's circumference 7,000 miles shorter than it actually was, and it was this measurement that Columbus used. Most scholars also wildly exaggerated the size of Eurasia and seriously underestimated the size of the ocean. Therefore, Columbus wrongly stipulated that 3,000 miles lay between Spain and Japan instead of 12,000 miles, which was the correct distance. This was not a foolish mistake, as many experts of the day estimated this distance with Columbus, and there was no way to prove him wrong since no one had actually sailed west to find out. Bound and determined to discover a new spice trading route, Columbus boldly presented his case before the Portuguese court in 1485. His proposal was negated because a team of experts contended that Columbus had underestimated the distance. Once again, he was undeterred and took his case to Venice, Genoa, and England under King Henry VII, all of whom rejected him. Even the Catholic monarchy in Spain disregarded Columbus, but after defeating the Moors at Granada and running on nationalistic momentum, Ferdinand had Columbus recalled. He was provided with 3 ships, and on August 3, 1492, Columbus embarked from the Palos de la Frontera port in Spain, and he plunged headfirst into the open, endless ocean blue. Thank you for watching my video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please feel free to like and subscribe, and let me know what you thought in the comments below. In my next video, I'll be covering Columbus's 4 voyages to the New World. I'll also be covering some of the other Spanish conquistadors and their run-ins with the natives. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the controversy surrounding Columbus today, and why perhaps it's not so smart to view history through the context of a 2019 lens. But in any case, you won't want to miss it. I'll see you all next time.